Do you mind if you take notes? Oh, I may take it. It
doesn't matter.
Okay, it's going to be JavaScript.
Yeah. Or do you mind if I remove the rear mic, because people have tendency to speaking to that one and then I can't read their name tag.
Sure, we don't need the rear mic. We've got one mic.
So if someone asks, you know what.
Okay. Yes. Do we have a mic for speakers? Just down here. Yes, the pink box. I shall try this.
Actually, hang on a minute. Let me try this first.
This? Does this mic work? Oh, good. You're in Tsvwg, the exciting place to take notes. Probably the most exciting working group ever to take notes in. And guess what? We're looking for a note taker for today's meeting.
Go.
Well, you know, we really love document reviewers so we can actually get things published from the working group. But equally in the meeting, we love somebody to volunteer to take notes so we can actually start.
I'm sorry, I just walked in. You want someone to take notes?
Yes,
I would.
please.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stuart. Much appreciated.
Hello. So I'm going to be the JavaScribe. Please make sure you show properly your unobscured name tag to me here, and your name will be hopefully correctly spelled in the Java room, and then Stuart here will write it down in the minutes. Thank you.
Okay. Go find meeting materials. That way you can find them too. All right. Just a minute. Eating your own dog food here. Okay. And yeah, let's do it this way. We'll give up the browser ribbon space. I don't care. All right.
Okay, so welcome. This is Tsvwg. We're pleased to meet in Berlin in a nice wide room. If you're coming to give a presentation, you have to come over here on the left, which is by our side, which is where the pink box is.
And you need to pay attention to this. The secretary has a number of standing offers. This is one of them. This is the note well. If you attend this meeting, it applies to you. Most of you who come are familiar with it. Those who aren't should become familiar with it, please. Okay, I'd like to publicly thank Mikhail and Stuart. So we now have a note taker and a JavaScribe. A reminder that if you want your drafts noticed by Tsvwg, you should put Tsvwg in any internet draft submitted. And Gory and I are always looking for interested help up here. You don't actually have to be talented. You just have to be interested. Okay. Document review request. I'm not going to read this slide. Basically says that reviews quality of documents. If you'd like your document high quality, which means you'd like reviews, you should review others. I'm going to put a sharper point on this. Between the authors of current working group drafts and at least a couple more that we're going to be asked to adopt here, we are going to be, the chairs are being asked to move more than one document a month through this working group between now and the end of this year. So document authors, pay attention. If you expect your document to go through working group last call between now and the end of the year, we chairs expect you to review at least 2 other documents during working group last call. And we will observe who does reviews and who doesn't in choosing which documents we send to last call, working group last call in what order. You have been forewarned. Yeah, this is round 1. Round 2 is the AQM meeting on Friday morning. Okay, now we get to turn to what we've gotten done. We've gotten 2 RFCs published since IETF 95. We have 2 drafts in the RFC editor queue. Both are in reference weight. Details in kind of SCTP is part of the massive WebRTC bundle, which at some point is going to come out of the RFC editor in a major explosion of RFCs. Network transport circuit breakers is waiting on the UDP guidelines draft, which we will discuss shortly. We have 1 draft in post IESG approval processing. This is the long-suffering diffserv for WebRTC draft. We have 1 last issue, which has been discussed on the list. What do you do if using a non-zero DSCP black holes the traffic? The high-level answer seems to have been agreed among all concerned is, look, this is a path probe problem. WebRTC uses ICE to send stun path probes. It will be solved this way, but there's some details to work out. That's RTC Web's job. That's RTC Web's job later this week. With luck, we will have a plan going forward. The most likely outcome, as Magnus, who's proposed on the list, is that there'll be a little bit of language in this draft to say there's a problem here, see the RTC Web Transports draft, and some language will land the RTC Web Transports draft to point out use of ICE and timing of documents in the RTC web space. We have 1 ID in post-IETF last call processing. This is the UDP Usage Guidelines Update 5405 BIS. Your chairs are absolutely positively determined that this draft is not going to be in this state in Seoul. There was discussion in TCPM on Monday. We think we know a path forward. More to the point, that path comes with a timeout in about 6 weeks, at which we will take something like the text currently in the draft, observe that TCPM is still talking about RTO, and shove this draft forward. There's way too many things far more important in this draft than some of the RTO nuts and bolts. So the goal is that that between what was discussed in TCPM and the authors, we should have final text about 6 weeks. Pasi, one of the TCPM chairs.
Yeah, Pasi Saralahti. Hi. So the reference is to. I will bring to you. So the references to RTO consider are informative, right?
Mhm.
So I don't think it causes a kind of a definite problem.
Right. No, it's not that there's references across the drafts. It's that the RTO principles discussed in the TCPM draft have some implications for transport retransmission timeouts for UDP-based transport protocols. Those should be documented in this UDP guidelines draft, and there will be behind-the-scenes discussions between the UDP guidelines authors and the TCPM RTO draft authors in about the next month or so to see if we can figure out what the text should be. But we've got about a month here.
Yeah, but there is no technical kind of blocking.
Right.
So, like,
It's not TCPM's fault that this is being blocked. It's a technical issue that's been raised in the context of TCPM. There was a useful discussion in TCPM about how to move forward. Thank you very much for your help with that.
We take Lars's slides.
I don't know.
No, come here.
Okay.
So again, if you're going up to the mic and you don't have a name tag, I'm going to scold you. Please wear your name tag.
Okay. Courtesy of quick work by a number of folks, including the primary draft editor, the GRE and UDP draft is in IETF last call. The DiffServ intercon draft has completed working group last call. Arts publication request should be coming, what, next week or so?
Well, oh, good grief.
Yeah, like you.
We completed the working group last call. If you do have comments on this draft, make sure you send them in right now because we're about to the Shepherd write-up. If we don't hear anything, then that Shepherd write-up will be completed and sent for publication request, maybe as soon as I get home after my holidays. In other words, in a week or so.
That would be good. Okay. There's 3 more working group drafts that are ready for working group last call. The tunnel congestion feedback draft and the 2 SCP drafts, the iData chunk and the NAT support draft. ECN encapsulation guidelines. We have a new draft being split out of this draft. Bob Briscoe is going to talk about that split. And we have one draft we've adopted since the last meeting. This is the DiffServ 2 802.11 mapping draft. There'll be discussion on that. I don't know whether it's Fred or Tim doing that, but we do have slides. One of the two will do that. This draft is in very good shape, even for an early adopted draft. It's likely to go to work group last call between now and the end of the year. Okay, this a bunch of related drafts. Draft Johansson on congestion control in the context of 4G and 5G. There's a draft on 1-bit latency versus loss trade-off, PHB. The inter-areas group is still working on tunnels. There's a very active discussion of this draft of that draft in general over on that list. MTU keeps coming up in that discussion. You can go over there and enjoy. There was a BOF yesterday on low latency, low loss scalable throughput. Here's a list of the drafts. One of them is coming up. I believe that's in our Friday session to talk about a code point they would like to use. Actually, I've got 2 of them here. One of them is coming up in our session Friday for the code point. That's this one. Here we go. Highlight that. And then in addition, we will probably have some discussion of this generalized ECN draft, although I believe the conclusion after a few rounds of email behind the scenes is that what this draft is really about is applying ECN to TCP's control messages, and as such, it's going to land in TCPM. UDP encapsulation related drafts. There is the routing areas design team draft on how to think about encapsulation in general. NVO3 just met. Near as I can tell, what I think happened in that meeting is that of the 3 encapsulations, one in the middle, GUE, is probably headed over to int area, and they're on their way to picking one of the other 2 to move forward with. But if you care about NVO3, follow NVO3. NVO3 architecture draft is in parens. It's related to all of these. This one is with the area director over in routing. Publication has been requested. And boy, is this a popular area. 2 UDP transport related BOFs this IETF. I'm not going to read the draft lists. Quick BOF has happened, plus is upcoming. If you're interested, you have plenty of reading material. Okay. TCWG agenda. We're in the middle of the chair's slides and agenda bashing. We're going to do doc accomplishments and status, milestones due in drafts today. Friday we have drafts, and then we've inserted an AQM working group discussion into TCWG on Friday. And as proof that agendas actually do get bashed, I'm going to go ahead and bash our agenda right now. If you look at the agenda on the web, you'll see there's an item 3.2 about DiffServ intercon. We have no slides for that. That's a quick status update. So that DiffServ intercon is going to get covered in the chair's update. So there will not be an item 3.2. Okay, milestones review. Apologies for polyglot colors, but I decided to color code everything. DiffServ Intercon was originally supposed to be done in January. It's now done. SCTP, so GRE and UDP is done. Thank you for that. Thank you in particular to Lucy for a very fast turnaround, so we can say it's in IETF last call now, as opposed to going there. We're going to do. We think we're going to try to get the 2 SCTP drafts. That's this one and this one done in September. Panel congestion feedback probably goes to our group last call almost immediately after this meeting, with a goal to get this handed off to Spencer in August, and then the remaining 2 drafts that we currently have in the working group, which is the ECN and CAP draft, and here, let me get myself away from that to see if I can get that. It decided to help out. Never mind. That ECN and CAP draft and the 802.11 draft, we're hoping to see go to the IESG by the end of the year. These milestone updates will turn up on the website shortly after we're done. Shortly after this meeting week. We have 2 drafts calling for adoption. Draft Academic Tsvwg ECN response, which we're going to get to today, and there's what is called a 60/40 BIS draft, which is actually not a BIS draft. Bob apologizes for not getting the name right. It's actually an update draft that basically splits out some of the ECN considerations for IP and IP tunnels into a separate draft, and Bob will talk about why that draft exists tomorrow. All right, finally we get to the agenda. So we've already done items 1 and 2. Those 3 drafts we've done the status on. Item 3, we'll do UDP usage guidelines next. Item 3.2, consider the agenda bashed. We've done the status on DiffServ Intercon. That's working group complete. Charter and milestones. We've just done the milestone review. We can put the charter if anybody's interested. And this is the rest of today's agenda. We have 5 slots. I'm going to do. There's an ECN RTV circuit breakers topic. We had too much fun with the second go around on the RTV circuit breaker draft. We have TCB alternate backoff with ECN. The L4S modified semantics, an initial draft on forward error correction, and a lower effort abrupt behavior draft, a -00 version that Roland's going to talk about if time permits.
And the last draft, 5.5, is the one that we've been talking about for a while on scavenger topics, isn't it? So
yes,
that might be of interest if people want to scan through something in the meeting.
Mm-hmm. And Roland's been clear. This is a -00 draft. He's just getting started. Work needs to be done. I'm sure he would appreciate all the help he can get. Okay, Friday, we've got 2 working group drafts. We need to deal with DiffServ 802.11, and then adding just ropes to protocols that encapsulate IP, which will also include this new 60/40 update draft. Then we have the SCTP drafts. There's 4 of them. 2 working group drafts. 2 of them are not. The 4960 right issues draft is likely to become one sometime soon, and then we'll see what there is on this. We will see what there is to say on this UDP in CAP additional considerations draft. Finally, transfer options for UDP, and then translator protocols over UDP. If we get really lucky, we will move 9.2 to the end of today's session if we have spare time, because I don't think Tom can be here on Friday. And then in that shade of red, which is supposed to be maroon, Gory and I get to play AQM chairs at the end of the session Friday morning. You'll be able to judge how good an imitation we did. Okay. Any questions, comments, modifications on the agenda? All right. I think that was the last slide. It was indeed, which means Lars, UDP usage guidelines. Here, we'll put this, you can see what you're looking at.
I'll need to look this way because
Well,
I
you,
did.
you can look right
Okay,
here.
I didn't make these slides and I don't know what's in them, so this should be interesting.
But Lars, you told me they were okay.
Yeah. I mean,
Right.
I trust you. I trust you. Right. So the overarching theme here is please let us publish this thing. Right. So we did several, I think, updates even to the draft to address the various IETF last call comments. So they were quite helpful. There were a lot of nits that were caught, and there were a lot of other things that had been brought up, but we've forgotten that got finally addressed. You can read what we did, right? So it was some reshuffling, we updated things. The next slide, please, should probably talk about the current status. All edits are in there. We think Mark Allman has raised this issue about the RTT RTO text. We've made changes, but we haven't heard back from Mark whether he's okay with what we did. So that's the one outstanding thing. So that we really need to decide on, and the chairs already talked that there's a clock that's ticking here. I personally, whatever makes Mark happy and gets consensus and makes the chairs in the ISG happy is fair game with me at this point. So the options are we publish this as is, with a pointer to the draft over in TCP that talks about the specifics for TCP. Other option is we undo the changes and revert back to the original text, which is in 5405, which is a BCP that's still there. Or we use the updated text in 5405 bis and update it based on 6298, which is the TCP document, but don't point at the new draft in TCPM. I would like to do whatever is easiest.
Okay.
But I'm very biased here in terms of wanting to reduce work. The nice thing is that your timer totally overlaps with my vacation time, so
He gets to do it.
yeah. So those are the options, right? And I don't know if anybody has any preference for which ones they are. I think we have a slight tendency to like the first one there, right, Corey?
The first one's easiest by me, yes.
It's easiest for us,
and it
obviously.
seems to be consistent with what I hear in TCPM, but that's for others to judge.
Yeah. Right. Is there a next slide? Or is that the
No,
last one?
no, that's
That's
it.
Oops.
And let's see. Speaking as the shepherd for the draft, I think the first one is the most desirable outcome to take the text as is, perhaps some additional minor modifications. It's good to point over that RTO consider draft, which contains a very nice discussion of the area. If we can't, we have to fall back to something else. I think the bottom option is the fallback. We probably ought to at least be taking note of the RTO updates that were made in 6298.
Yeah, and this draft has sort of this tendency to attract change requests the longer it remains unpublished. So we are so close to having a zero queue for change requests that we should use the window and publish it
We're going to use
before more things change elsewhere that need to be updated.
Yes, the time has come.
Agreed.
In addition, I think we're starting to build up a queue of drafts behind this that are waiting for it. Network Circuit Breakers is not the only draft that's waiting for this. So.
And Corey will restart the
Right,
version
okay.
of this.
Okay, and this is not a nice thing to say, but seriously, if you do spot anything in this draft that is wrong, we are very willing to change it. It just because we're at the end of the
Especially
queue.
with typos.
Yeah, typos are really good to fix. So if you have any pending comments or any pending queries, just let us know now. Otherwise, it will get passed to the IESG in August.
Yeah. Any questions? Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All righty. Colin.
New Colin Williams.
I didn't hear that.
So I'm supposed to be nice now because it's my fault Colin's standing there.
Hi, I'm Colin. I'm here to talk about ECN. and circuit breaker and congestion control and ECN and stuff like that. Okay, these microphones are all really unsensitive. Can you hear me now? Yes. Okay, so I'm here to talk about ECN and circuit breakers and general response to ECN for non-TCP applications. So firstly, how I structure this, I want to briefly review how RTP congestion control works and how it's different to what happens with TCP. I'm going to briefly review the RTP circuit breaker, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of the issues that have arisen over the last few weeks. So RTP congestion control. Obviously, we have a feedback loop. We've got data going in one direction. You've got what's called RTCP, the RTP control protocol, giving you feedback packets in the other direction. And those feedback packets contain sort of indications of packet loss, ECN marking, delay, round trip times, and so on. Obviously, the dynamics of the congestion control very much depend on how often you send feedback, how often you can adapt your sending rate, and what type of feedback information you provide. The way these are done in RTP and in multimedia applications is very different to the way they're done in TCP. Specifically, for the sort of interactive conferencing applications that people are considering, the rate of adaptation and feedback is done on a timescale that's much more closely related to the video frame rate than it is to the network round trip time. Adaptation happens at fastest once every video frame, irrespective of how the video frame rate relates to the network round trip time. Quite often it happens once every several video frames. So it's quite possible, indeed quite likely, that the rate of adaptation is much slower than the network round trip time. You can only adapt your sending rate once every several round trip times. Especially when the round trip time is low, these things don't couple up very well. The way the feedback works in these protocols is such that they cannot react to ECN marks or losses on the timescale of a round trip time. Right? The feedback is aggregated, it's passed back every so often, at most once per frame, again, possibly even less often. So not only is it difficult to adapt at a particular timing rate, it's difficult to provide feedback at a particular rate. So these protocols are responding to aggregated feedback that is coming somewhat delayed. And that feedback probably is a list of all the ECN marks and loss marks and arrival timestamps in the packets. It may be somewhat more aggregated, but it's an aggregated and delayed feedback. And the sending rate is some function of the loss rate and the marking rate, looking at those aggregated rates as they arrive. The sending rate's bursty. It very much depends on the video content, but it's not greedy. There's a maximum usable sending rate. And these applications very much care about low latency, and they are very badly disrupted by packet loss. Next slide, please. Now, there's lots of ongoing work with congestion control and related things of RTP. The RMCAT working group is talking about congestion control for RTP. In the ABT core group, we've got the circuit breaker draft, which is talking about a fast trip circuit breaker for RTP sessions. 4 parts to that circuit breaker, 3 of which don't concern anyone in this group at all. Right? 3 of which are entirely, I hope, uncontroversial. First one is media quality. Right? If you're getting video coming back, if you're getting loss such that the video quality is too poor to be useful, it says you should stop sending. That should hopefully be obvious. If you get feedback saying that the media data is not being received and you're sending video, then maybe you should stop sending if it's just disappearing into the network entirely. Similarly, if you're sending video and you're not getting any feedback at all, again, you should stop sending. Those 3 are the straightforward ones. The more interesting one is the congestion circuit breaker. We get feedback coming back for congestion control purposes. It tells us things like summary loss rates, round trip times, and so on, fairly coarsely aggregated. The congestion circuit breaker tries to respond to this on a time scale which is longer than a congestion controller would operate on, but not particularly long. Right? it looks at persistent excessive congestion, where persistence is defined as the maximum, as triggering at a time not less than the maximum of 3 times the reporting interval. So you get 3 reports coming back telling you what sort of loss rate you're seeing, 10 round trip times, and 10 times the group of pictures duration, which is essentially the time at which you can adapt. So we have a timing interval, so we're seeing persistent congestion, and it says excessive congestion, and it deems congestion to be excessive if the sending rate, the nominal sending rate for the media is more than 10 times the predicted rate a TCP flow would get based on the Pad-I 1/√P TCP equation. And this is all thrown in, and it's all a little hazy, and the data we have coming back isn't quite the data we need, but it seems to work well enough for loss. And as far as we are aware, and we did speak with Gary when this was being done, this conforms to what's in the TSV circuit breaker draft. Next slide.
Yeah.
Now, we also, perhaps foolishly, decided to put some comments about ECN into this, since people are starting to talk about having ECN for RTP. And this proved pretty controversial. Now, what we have done is taken it out, and we're going to publish the circuit breaker draft without ECN currently, because it's needed for WebRTC, and it's needed pretty urgently, and ECN isn't widely enough deployed to matter.
Yeah.
But we do need to resolve this, because ECN, we hope, is going to be widely deployed, so we hope to have an answer for this. Now, what was in the draft was a statement that if you get ECN CE marked packets, and you get feedback that you're getting ECN CE marked packets, you should treat them as if they were lost for the purposes of doing the congestion control circuit breaker. And that was based in the statement in 3168, which said, upon receipt of ECN capable, an ECN CE packet, the congestion control needs to respond in the same way as it would to a lost packet. We changed it so it said should rather than must, because we were at least slightly aware that people were playing around with how ECN and AQM worked. And we wanted to allow a little bit of flexibility. And that's based on the RTP ECN stuff, RFC 6679, which says you should mark packets with ECN 0 unless the receiver expresses a preference. So the expectation it would be ECT 0 packets that you are responding to. And we thought this was all fine and nothing there. And then we got to the ISG, and Miria put a discuss saying, actually people are looking at AQM schemes that mark much more often than this. And there's been a lot of mailing list discussion and some phone calls and some offline discussion about that. And it turns out that actually there's quite a big disconnect and quite a lack of consensus on how these applications should respond to ECN. Next slide, please.
Okay. Before I go on, I want to quickly point out, this is an example of a very well-placed AD discuss. We are now having a very useful discussion based on a discussed position.
Yes. It raised a whole bunch of issues we hadn't thought about, certainly. Yeah. So there are a bunch of open questions which have come up as a result of this. Firstly, should circuit breakers respond to ECN congestion experience marks at all? Or should this be something that responds to loss? If they do respond, how should they respond? And in general, how should the response to ECN congestion experience marks relate to the response to loss? And is that recommendation changing over time? And if so, what impact does that change have? Next slide, please. So the first question is, should the circuit breaker actually respond to ECN congestion experience marks? Now, what's in the TSV circuit breaker draft is it says that the measure of congestion level you're using to drive the circuit breaker can also count ECN congestion marks as part of that measurement. But in that case, the loss must also be measured to provide a complete view of the level of congestion. Now, we in the circuit breaker, we are measuring loss, we're measuring round trip times, and if ECN is used, we're measuring ECN marks. So it would seem that we are measuring all the right things. But the transport circuit breaker draft doesn't say anything about whether loss has to occur before the circuit breaker triggers. It just says you can measure it and put it into the thing. Now, to me, it seems like it ought to be acceptable to trigger a circuit breaker based on persistent excessive congestion reported by congestion experience MUX. Other people seem to disagree with that and think that that's not significant enough to trigger a circuit breaker, and you need to wait for loss. Now, obviously, the thresholds, we can have an argument about what should be the threshold at which the circuit breaker triggers based on congestion experience MUX. But I think there's also an argument to be had as to whether it is appropriate to trigger a circuit breaker based solely on CE MUX, or if you need to wait until the loss has happened. And I don't know whether it's worth discussing this now or finishing the slides and then having a bigger discussion about the whole thing.
How many more slides have you got?
Two more.
Should we do, this is a topic we should talk about as well as what happens in the draft. So,
Yes.
so
There's a bunch
let's have a
of
proper
points.
discussion, but let's just show the next 2 slides.
Yeah, and I think things are a little intertwined. So assuming that the circuit breaker is triggerable based on ECN MUX, okay. I think we actually want this to happen. I think we want a circuit breaker that triggers before loss occurs. The reason for that is that if you've pushed the queue to overload, you've added some latency, and depending how the queuing is done, that may be a small amount of latency if it's one of the very short queue ones, or it may be a larger amount of latency. You've also caused some loss. And in the case of the multimedia, that loss is very disruptive to the user experience, right? It can't be repaired just by retransmitting the packet. It causes a visible glitch in the video, and that may last for a second or so. So you want to avoid that loss. So we don't actually want to push the queue into overload. We want to have a circuit breaker that responds to the congestion experience MUX. Based on that, to me, it would seem acceptable to trigger somehow based on the ECN marking rate. Perhaps proportionally to 1 over the square root of the marking rate if we're using a classic ECN, perhaps proportionally to 1 over the marking rate if we're using something like L4S, with an appropriate scaling factor to make sure, blah, 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 and being very aggressive with the circuit breaker if losses does occur. And there's obviously a discussion to be had about what should that scaling factor be, and I think a general discussion as to, just for congestion in general, I think that should say not RTP specific as to how should these things respond to ECN MUX. And again, the question is this sort of thing acceptable in principle, subject to arguments about exactly the details of how you do it, and if not, why isn't this the right thing? I think in general, there are questions to be asked about how should the ECN response and the loss response relate? Obviously, the old ECN recommendations were that you should respond to ECN CE MUX in the same way as you should respond to loss. That seems to be changing. Okay. How is it changing? How is that affecting backwards compatibility? And is it changing for ECT0 flows as well as for ECT1 flows? Similarly, with the new AQM schemes being developed, what requirements are they placing on the CE response? Which seems to be something which hasn't been discussed very widely, because much of the development has been done in the context of TCP. And specifically, are these AQM schemes compatible with slowly responsive congestion control algorithms that batch the feedback up and send it back many RTTs later and then adapt based on that? I don't expect we'll necessarily come to a conclusion on any of this stuff here, but I think there's a discussion to be had on what the right directions are for some of this.
Questions, please.
Matt Mathis, and I admit to having been away from this stuff for several IETFs, and so please excuse me if I make a mistake here. Some of the marking schemes, although I don't know that they're currently on the table, were actually, well, there have been marking schemes on the table which mark at very high rates, and one could imagine standardizing on that. Since under these conditions the marks are being delivered, I am inclined to believe that the correct handling for ECN is actually for the circuit breaker to ignore it because the signaling is being delivered. And if the protocol requested ECN, then it should be doing something appropriate about it. It may be that at some future time, once the new ECN is better defined, the circuit breaker can have an appropriate response. But in absence of that information, it's far better off for the circuit breaker to assume the application is getting the right signals and is doing what it intended.
Yeah, I mean, currently the RTP circuit breaker draft, which we're hoping will be published, ignores ECN entirely. So it just says, we don't know how to do this. We will revisit it in future.
I would put a placeholder in that document and continue to ignore it.
It's in there, yeah. But the discussion that I'm hoping to start here is, what should it say in the long term?
The other work needs to be finished first, period.
Thank you. That's helpful. Bob?
Hi, Bob Briscoe. I saw this conversation going on and I didn't contribute to it because I didn't feel it was actually based on any code or any experience. And I think that's true, isn't it?
Sure.
Yeah.
I'm hoping someone who has such experience can provide some guidance.
Yeah. The position we're at is everybody's realized this, nothing bad has happened, the text isn't in the current document. Then the question is, what document should we write to help these people actually do the right thing?
Yes.
Do you know what document we should write? What it should say?
I mean, we have a bunch of people doing congestion control algorithm specifications in IETF, all of which, a bunch of which are not TCP and take take ECN feedback into account. And they do it in ways which assume that an ECN CE mark is equivalent to a lost packet. And I get the impression that the people doing ECN and AQM are not happy with that, but that hasn't worked its way to the rest of the IETF.
But let's go back to circuit breaker, because I think you've generalized it to congestion control, but I think this is about circuit breaker, isn't it?
I think there's a general conversation that needs to be happen, and I also think the circuit breaker is a form of congestion control, and I realize some people disagree with that.
Okay, yeah, I would,
But
yes.
Okay, so on circuit breaker, I think your slide 7, if you go back one, I'm now going to talk without having any full experience of a circuit breaker. I mean, I have written polices and analyzed polices, but not circuit breakers as such. Mainly because I didn't like the idea of a circuit breaker. So I think the confusion here is that it looks like you're trying to say the circuit breaker is protecting you. It's not, it's protecting everyone else from you. And so if your media quality goes down because of the circuit breaker, well, that's just tough because it's about to kill you anyway.
Driving,
you can't complain you didn't get a mint on your pillow when you go to a prison.
I think my point though is that driving the queue to overload and causing loss does hurt everybody else.
Yes.
And we're trying to stop that.
Yes, and yeah, that was the next point I was going to make. That just because you're getting ECN doesn't mean to say you're not driving another queue to loss that hasn't got ECN enabled.
But you'd be seeing loss in that case.
Exactly.
Right. So
that doesn't mean to say your ECN is something that having reacted earlier to the ECN would have solved the loss. The loss is a different queue.
I want to go back to something.
I'm not sure I understand what you're saying.
I'm trying to argue against each point.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're causing loss, then you will see the loss, and that will trigger the circuit breaker if it's excessive.
Yes.
And we're not saying to change any of that. We're saying you're not seeing any loss. You are seeing a tremendous amount of ECN marking, more than you would expect in normal operation. Should that then act as a circuit breaker?
Let me go put one little piece in here. You're seeing a tremendous amount of marking, which you are taking as an indication that your congestion control has failed, and therefore think about what your congestion control is that has failed.
Or someone else's has. But in general, the advice in 3168, which I don't think has come into this discussion, is if the congestion level on a queue is persistent and means you've got to have a long queue for some time, it should switch off ECN and go to loss. And that's the point at which I think a circuit breaker should be operating after that's happened. If it operates before, that means it's jumping. It's got too light a trigger.
Okay, we got that. Let's keep quick comments coming here because we're going to run out of time.
So just to respond to that, if you've got to the state where you're causing loss, you have disrupted all the other flows on that link.
Okay, good. Christian Wittmer. The whole point of ECN is to trigger rate adaptation so that your queues are small.
Sure.
So you don't want to second guess that. And in particular, you have to somehow trust the application there. If it is getting those marks, it's because it cares. If it requests those marks, it's because it cares about maintaining the delay in the network small. It's designed to react to that and adapt. The failure to adapt is when you see losses. But the marks themselves are not an indication of losses. And the one thing you should certainly not do is have some kind of hacky formulas like square root or whatever in your code, because those are going to be wrong because you cannot predict. Okay.
All right. Matt Mathis again. The disconnect is under the original ECN, it was supposed to be equivalent to loss. What has been realized as this comes directly out of the data center TCP work, you want ECN to be an early signal.
Yes.
And so does not mean that you're disrupting other flows. And so the problem is they haven't decided what the control function is. Somebody know the details of DECBIT, but the DECBIT was essentially equivalent to what ECN could do. And it normally ran at a rate that was 50% marking. I mean, that was a default rate, was 50% marking, and it provides a very stable control system at a set point negotiated between whatever the network is doing, whatever the congestion control is doing, and it doesn't mean that there's a problem. And that solution should be within scope for ECN, and that means you can't use ECN on a circuit breaker.
So I agree that type of solution should be in scope of ECN. I don't understand why the statement that it can't then be treated to be used for a circuit breaker follows. That just means you need to figure out what the appropriate threshold is.
Because you don't know where the threshold is. You don't know what it means.
But what I struggle to understand, both for the circuit breaker and for defining a congestion control algorithm based on this, is if you don't know what the threshold is, how can you define either a circuit breaker or a congestion controller that responds to that?
So there is a deployment problem for all of these new generation ECNs having to do with we're slightly deployed on both the marking side and on the response side. And there is a complicated story there that other people are working on. In most cases, it doesn't hurt you that much. One of the things that I think people are gradually coming to understand is congestion control is, at this current scale of the internet, congestion control is actually a lot less important than people thought it was. You can have a significant population of people who are doing something that is completely stupid, and the network doesn't notice. It just doesn't matter. And part of it is, to the first approximation, it's all bottlenecked at the edges, and the core is so much bigger than the edges that whatever, even a significant fraction of the edges running absolutely flat out doesn't matter. And so it's not nearly as urgent a problem as we used to think it was.
Can I ask the remaining speakers to give a couple of sentences, because this is a new piece of work that's going to be starting after this rather than something we have to fix at this IETF. So please add a couple of sentences to the debate, and we're going to cut the line there.
Dave, Todd, I pretty much agree with the previous three speakers. I did want to point out that I see congestion, ECN marking rates well in excess of 90% in some scenarios, and everything is fine. However, I would prefer to also fix the edges too, Matt. And the point that I wanted to make that is a possible add-on to these concepts is seeing a combination of drop and mark is a clear sign that something is misbehaving.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Again, there seems to be, what I'm hearing is that there is no way of relating the ECN marking rate to the rate at which you should be sending.
Work in progress is what I think you heard on that one.
And that's something that we need to have some understanding of that relation if we are to define congestion control for non-TCP applications.
Colin?
Koen de Schepper. One thing I think is important to know is that the sender decides actually what feedback it wants. That the sender decides what kind of feedback it wants. If you set ECT 0, it means the network is marking at the same rate as drop. If you set ECT 1, it's something which is going to be defined in the future. So as long as you don't know what is the response of the network to ECT1, you should not set ECT1 as a sender. And you don't see the problem.
The feedback we have gotten is that you cannot make the assumption that ECT 0 marks are equivalent to loss.
This is true.
Yes,
Is that the case? Because
That's the case.
that is the case.
today, as long in the standards, there's still set that that's drop.
And that's another topic for coming up. Next speaker.
So channeling John Leslie, he's
Okay.
saying, no, the delay might be a better indicator than ECT.
Just to follow up on what David said, if you're getting a mixture of loss and ECN, it doesn't necessarily mean things are misbehaving because the loss can be radio.
Can you speak into the mic,
Sorry.
Bob? I can't hear you.
You can get a mix of ECN and loss because of loss due to other things than congestion, like transmission losses. Yeah. Yeah, but yeah, we're trying to fix that, and that will be fixed. You know.
Okay, thanks very much. And I guess Colin will remain interested in this topic and would love to know the envelope over which ECN can be used for a range of applications. And we've got to get these thoughts going to Colin, please. Please discuss the list.
Also, it would, I think, be very useful if someone who understands this stuff goes and talks to our MCAT.
I think this is 3186.
Okay, I will note that. Okay, and now we start to talk about ECN again,
Yes.
in a new breath.
Yeah.
All right. A new topic, ECN. You haven't heard about it this week, have you? All right. The context here is that there was this previous document on the work that we called APE, alternative backup with ECN, that has been replaced by a split in two documents. One of the two was presented in TCPM earlier this week. It's about how exactly we, the authors of this document, believe that you should be responding to a regular ECN, normal ECN marking, which we believe should be different to the reaction to loss. And the problem with this document, the problem with some other work around ECN, is that not only does it, well, the other document, not only does it propose something new, it also contradicts some of the rules that RFC 3168 lays out. And so we want to let the sender be able to react differently to an ECN mark than it does to loss. There's actually, for this particular issue, some text in 3168, and the specific paragraph is also copied over to 4774. And this is a limitation to experimentation. We want to make this a bit more open. Okay, yeah, well, go.
Common Perkins, there's similar text in RFC 6679, which also needs updating.
All right. So there is this draft that I'm now going to talk about, which is the 00 version of the draft that we sent to the list some time ago, which attempts to change these programmatic text passages to allow experimentation. There is also a 01 version of this document, which you have to be a very fast reader to read because we posted it earlier in this session. But I'm going to talk about it. You're going to explain it a little bit. Okay, here are the programmatic text passages. The idea is to show you the issue and not get into wordsmithing right here in this session. It's very welcome on the list and maybe later, but we don't want to waste time on just wordsmithing of the proposed update. This is one issue text. Upon the receipt of an ECN capable transport for a single CE packet, congestion control algorithms must be essentially the same as the congestion control response to a single drop packet. So there's a capital must here. And an example at the end. Next slide. And then there's another problematic text bit, which is only in 3168, maybe also some other RFC, but not 4774, which talks about TCP and says if the sender receives an ECN echo ACK packet, then the sender knows that congestion was encountered in the network on the path. And this should be treated just as a congestion loss in non-ECN capable TCP. So this is a non-capital should, which may not be an issue, but there's also the capital must in a different place of the document. So altogether, these two pieces create a bit of a problem for us. There was a brief list discussion on this with John Leslie. He said that he finds it a bit confusing that we start to mention Cwind and SS-Thresh pretty early in the text, and anyway, our 3168 is confusing in this. We will address that by updating, well, the introduction to clarify that there are certain passages in 3168 that are really about TCP, and certain that are general, and this text bit refers to this and the other to the other. There was also an issue with the update text that had the end quote. Well, so there was a missing line break at the end, after the text that would replace some other text, so that made it a little hard to read. And something about the semantics in 3168. We may end up removing this. So this goes into wordsmithing. Actually, this 01 update that has been posted does not address these things yet. That doesn't mean that we don't want to address them. It means that something else was more urgent for discussion here in this particular meeting.
Right. Can I just pause for a second? If you're sat next to a seat that's vacant, can you put your hand in the air? There are a number of empty seats around. If people do want to sit in them, please just push your way through and sit down.
That's helpful. Okay, so here's the novelty, the new stuff that we just added to the document. Next. It's now a document that generally, it doesn't just say we want to update the ECN congestion response, but says we want to relax some rules in RFC 3168 and potentially some of the following RFCs where certain of the similar text passages are that get in the way of experiments. So there are certain experiments that even if you would do it, as an IETF experimental RFC, contradict certain texts that are in these in this RFC and maybe some follow-up RFCs. One is what I just explained. Another one is a limitation regarding the use of ECT1. I don't think there's a strict must in there regarding it, but there is at least text that doesn't really. Well, it's not suggested to just use ECT1 altogether for all traffic in 3168. And there's also some text regarding downward compatibility that essentially says it's okay if a router just drops a packet if it sees ECT1. That was about routers that was before the time that this ECT1 code point update was proposed. We believe such routers belong on the trash, and at least we don't want to make it okay to act like that. So it would be much better to have a statement that says don't just drop when you see ECT1 and you don't know what it is, right? I mean, that's basically what this update is about. So L4S, you've heard about this in the BOF, is a great opportunity that we don't want to lose just because of these things that actually belong on the trash pile. Okay. Next, and the second rule that, so in the end, altogether the third rule really that this new draft talks about is related to a draft that you had that was presented in TCPM earlier this week by Marcello regarding using ECN on ECN control packets. 3168 doesn't allow you to use ECN on SYN, on PureX, on window probes and things like that, and this draft lays out arguments for why you could use ECN on it. So I don't want to get into having a discussion about whether this is okay or not okay, but we believe it's not okay for a router to drop a packet because it sees ECN being marked on the packet where the original RFC says it shouldn't or it mustn't. That's in line with the whole be liberal in what you accept kind of principle. You shouldn't just drop it because of that. It's probably useful to have a statement that says do not drop packets because they seem to conflict with these old rules. That's all about allowing new experiments, and that's all I have to say.
Magnus Westlund. So how strong is the recommendation to use ECT zero marking for the moment?
Let me go play contributor.
Yeah, I'd like a, I mean, he's a better guy to answer that. Being an author of the
Should I be
document.
the chair?
So could you quick repeat the question so I know what I'm trying to answer before I say good things?
So what's the recommendation on using ECT zero? I don't think it exists such a recommendation.
I believe there's a slight preference for ECT zero. I don't think there's anything really strongly stated. This is David Black speaking at the floor mic as an individual. And the other thing I was going to say is that I'm going to participate in the discussion as an individual from here because I'm one of the authors of 3168 Once Upon a Time. And what I think I've seen here, and thank you for the presentation, Michael, is that there's enough reason to believe that experiments at all three of these places are productive, and hence a quick procedural draft that simply takes the shackles off the experimenters is what's wanted here. We don't have to debate about what the experiments are going to do or anticipate what they might, results may or may not be, just a procedural draft that removes the obstacles of 3168 for experimentation, and then the experimental RFCs would obviously go through the entire IETF process, including IESG approval.
Magnus Westlund. So the reason I asked about ECT zero is was the question if you actually need to strengthen that recommendations during the of applications that aren't doing experiments, that they actually, and once the existing behavior for ECN should really must use ECT zero.
I will note that.
Okay.
Bob Briscoe, yeah, I would also say that anyone can do experiments, but if you want to do an IETF sanctioned experiment, then the only definition of ECT1 at the moment is the ECN nonce. So if you want to use something in the IP header and have the IETF sanction it, you have to write a draft about it. You don't just do it because the IETF won't sanction it.
So this is actually, there's a small text now in the 01 document that talks about scope, and it really talks about IETF sanctioned things and about, you know.
Yeah.
Apparently, I'm the working chair sitting here now. But the purpose of this document is not to make these code points free for all. The purpose of these code points is to allow a PS to explicitly allow some experimental use of some of the things it's specified in the PS, with the hope that the experiments conclude and we produce a PS update.
So
this is not a free-for-all.
My point was that if RTP wants to use ECT1 for something else than the nonce, it can't at the moment. Well, no, you were talking about it doing middle box mangling detection and things like that with it. Yeah.
Yes.
So RFC 66.
It doesn't. I asked this question about a year ago. What is ECT1 used for in RFC 6679? And it doesn't say what it's used for. It just says you can negotiate about it. It doesn't say what it's for.
So what RFC 6679 says is that you're recommended to use ECT 0, but you can negotiate to use ECT 0, ECT 1, or random marking. That's all it says.
It doesn't say what it's for.
Sure. I mean, certainly the intent was that it would be used for things like the nonce. I don't know of anyone actually doing that. Yes. Do you remember what I actually stood up to say at this point? I'm Colin Perkins. So responding to David Black's comment, I mean, yes, I agree there should be a procedural thing that just says we're changing this to allow experiments. I think it should also say that the authors are aware that there are such experiments ongoing. Because it's not just a theoretical possibility, it's actually, there are active experiments. And
it does, it points at, cites LFRS, it cites the manual draft, it cites the experiments as such.
Yes, yes. I mean, I think it is possibly worth saying, and I forget whether it actually says this, but if it doesn't, it should say explicitly, you can't rely on the assumption that ECN is equivalent to loss for congestion.
It explicitly says that.
Yes.
As an update with the text to update that, and we can add, I guess, 679 text as well.
Yeah, we should probably say that we update this one as well.
Koen de Schepper.
Koen.
So my remark previously was, the question was ECT 0 in the network. Is it still being treated in the same way as drop? Because in the presentation I saw, you plan only to change the behavior on the sender.
Yes.
To be different than drop. So
Yes.
can we still assume that on ECT 0, the network still drops in the same way as it marks? Or are we also allowing experiments to change the network behavior to be different between drop and ECT 0 marking? And I think that's an important difference. ECT 1, we want to change the network behavior different. ECT 0, it still assumes that the network is doing the same thing. And I think this is not used to rely on unless we say ECT 0 is also free for experimentation and there is no reliability anymore between dropping and ECT 0 in the network. So we have 2 experiments in that case. Or 3.
I think 3 experiments, yeah, but
David Black to say a little bit about what the experiments are. So there's Cohen's referring to one of them, which is decoupling ECT 0 and ECT 1. The other 2 experiments would be responding to ECN CE marks as something other than drop equivalent. And then the draft that was discussed in TCPM on Monday that proposes using ECN on control packets, e.g. TCP. So there have, as Christian sort of explained earlier, while all the RFCs currently say that CE marks are drop equivalent, we are observing network behaviors in which better response may be not treatment as drop equivalent, and experimentation that space appears to be justified.
Colin Perkins, I mean, it seems from the feedback we got on the circuit breaker draft that things like the way things like CODL and PI respond, mark packets, requires these things not be treated as equivalent to loss. So yeah, that's what I was trying to highlight, that this is actually being done in a way that requires you to do it differently now.
So in a way, I mean, it would even be wrong to require today that a router treats it exactly equivalent as loss, because that's not what you get. You know, you in-queue the packets, you get a different queue dynamic anyway when you mark a packet.
Right.
So it's not, you know, it's kind of the moot point.
The equivalent to loss is loosely equivalent to loss, not precisely equivalent to loss.
Yeah.
I think that's understood. Matt Mathis, by the way, and I didn't want, that's not where the quibble is. That's not where the problem is. I really like the idea of this document, at least maybe a way of casting it that would make it a little bit easier, is these are the areas that will have to be changed when we finish the experiment, right? Because these are all the things that will need to be updated, and use something less normative than suspending them or something like that in the interim.
Okay. Okay. No problem with that.
I'm just going to plus one what Matt said. He had my entire thing.
All right. Waiting for David.
I would have, Bob Briscoe, I would have agreed with this were it not for that last point. Well, everyone else is agreeing about the last point. I thought the whole point of this was that to write a draft now so that the ISG can agree some experiments. Yeah?
Yeah.
And so if we're going to say this draft is not going to act until the experiments are finished, that's not going to achieve what.
Okay, I mean, okay, can I just comment on the IESG thing? It's not because the IESG have to do it, it's because if these experiments are going on in the community with a document that's been 10 years out there, and people think this is the way, we should give a heads up to the community as well. So it's helpful to perhaps publish that as a PS update of the base spec, which really alerts people to it. The IESG can override or not publication of an experiment on a PS. This is a procedural thing. The important thing is not that procedural thing. The important thing here is that the community knows what's actually going to happen here and knows that experiment is taking place and probably gets a heads up that really, in the fullness of time, this group is probably going to rewrite that spec to be clearer and not have the vagaries which exist at the moment.
David Black again, just reminded of something else that this draft needs to do for the community. It is time to declare the ECN nonce experiment failed and that RFC historic, and that's part of enabling experiments with ECT1.
Okay, yeah.
Bob Briscoe again. So this draft doesn't say all the things that would happen after these experiments. It says what's only needed to enable these experiments. And I actually had written a draft myself and was getting some co-authors to agree it, but you beat me to it. So
Stuart Cheshire, I'm going to take note taker's prerogative because I can't take notes and stand in line as well. Quick data point for everybody in the room who may not be aware of this. We're talking about the ECN nonce experiment and detecting brokenness on the path. In the current seeds of iOS and macOS, 50% of all TCP connections to all services for all protocols are using ECN. And we're gathering data to do A/B comparison. And so far, we have no evidence of any brokenness anywhere on the internet. Now, this is... some of you may have heard that last September, when we rolled out iOS 9, completely by coincidence, not intentionally, a minor change in the VPN code caused it to drop packets that were marked CE. And we discovered one ISP, by coincidence here in Germany, that always marks all packets in and out CE 100% of the time, which had bad consequences for VPN.
Bad consequences for the circuit breaker as well.
And the great news is that what happened is what you would expect to happen, which is that ISP fixed their network very rapidly, and now we don't have a problem.
On a much more mundane note, I mean, the procedural issue is that we are currently telling people in other working groups that their drafts need to be revised, pointing at a bunch of individual drafts as the documentation and rationale for that.
Yeah.
And we really need an RFC quickly that documents that this stuff is happening, so we can point people at it. So don't treat it like 3168 says.
David Olson, Sandvine. As one who's working with people who are implementing ECN marking, I'm really concerned to hear that they might be changing it to be different than drop. Whenever I talk to developers about what should we do with an ECN mark, it's like, well, the standard says it's the same as drop. So, and the response always comes back, but that's unfair. You're letting that packet through just because it's got an ECN mark. So it's pretty clear that if senders don't respond to marks exactly the same way as drops, they will get an unfair advantage. Right? So
no, it's the other way around.
If
marking is going to be
I'm
common.
talking about mark 0 right now, ECT 0. So the sender has, if basically think about it, a shaper or a policer, right? You fail the test, right? So you're out of profile. You can either drop it or you can mark it, right? There's not another criteria that's specified right now.
So there's another queue. Anyway.
No, you're talking about the dual.
Yeah. So
I'm talking about the ECN
Right.
what it says right now for the ECN mark ECT0. So
So the concrete proposal for ECT0 is this draft that's in TCP/M. We have done quite extensive experiments with it, looking at the unfairness, the results. Of course, you're unfair, but it's not nearly as bad as you might imagine. It's really a different story. It's TCP/M. It's a different document, but you can go look at it. We can have a conversation about it. This is just opening this up.
is it still going to say that it's the same as drop? Or
No, the response is not the same as drop.
what is the shaper supposed to do?
Beg your pardon?
What is the shaper supposed, or the thing that's, what's the network supposed to do to these packets that have?
So in the experiment of like this TCP/M draft that I was talking about, the assumption is that nothing changes in the network.
Okay, so mark.
It's just
when
sender
you would-
being
if you
differently.
would- If you would drop, you should mark? That's the.
Yeah.
That's, okay, so that's not talking about changing that then?
No,
Okay.
not for ECT0. It's just for ECT0, it's just the sender side behavior that changes.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay, we need to try to move on here. We've got about 15 minutes, try to squeeze in a few more agenda items. Do you want to start the adoption call on this draft here on the list?
I would like, shall we do a shorthand meeting on Friday?
Okay, so we're going to take a sense of the room at this next session on Friday, since O1 was just posted, about whether to proceed in this direction, probably adopt the O1 draft as this lightweight process draft. Okay, Bob, I think you're next on L4S and ECN. Or have we got a theme today?
Yeah. This is. This
10 minutes.
This is exactly what we've been talking about. It's defining what ECT1 response will be and won't be. So let's continue. Relates to the L4S BOF you saw yesterday. Next slide. There were 3 parts to standardize, and this talk is about the identifier. Next. So the draft's been around now for a year as an individual draft still, mainly because we needed the BOF to decide where it was going to sit. It contains requirements to choose an identifier first. We've all been assuming we're talking about ECT1, but this is like a due diligence process to decide whether there is a better identifier or not, right? And it points out that there's likely to be compromises because we're short of space. ECT1 isn't ideal, nothing is ideal. And these are the requirements it gives in the draft. Must traverse end-to-end, that's host to network, network to network, network to middle box to host, so on. Must work for v4, v6 and be transport protocol agnostic, must be incrementally deployable, must work for AQMs in tunnels, where the AQM itself is has a tunnel either side of it or it's in a lower layer. Must consume minimal code points, must avoid reordering if you're moving things into a different queue. So the whole flow is handled by the same queue. And that means as well, control packets should also move into the right queue with the rest of the flow, if we're talking about TCP or things like it. And the choice of which identifier, the words in bold, turned out to be distinguishing. So the table on the next slide identifies just those. A few choices, diff-serve code point plus ECN, the whole ECN field, if ECN is never going to be used by operators, and that's unlikely to happen. Well, it might happen still, but we don't know. And ECT1 and CE. On the basis of that, ECT1 and CE were chosen. There were other possibilities that were quickly discounted in the draft. They're all in the appendix. They're all laid out. One that someone pointed out recently that isn't in there is the evil bit, which again you would discount fairly quickly because it's well, the ISJG probably wouldn't let you have it because I've tried that one. So next I'm going to go.
There was
next
a
slide.
presentation in the Applied Networking Research workshop on Saturday that showed that the evil bit survives through the network much better than most of the other IP header bits.
Yes. No, it does. Yeah. And actually, I mean, I have a draft that's been long-standing in int area, but it's expired now. to say that if you use the evil bit to say the ID field in v4 has a new meaning, you get a lot of bits out of one bit. All right. Anyway, next. So I'm now picking just that column about the chosen identifier, and there are two sub-columns, or the one we believe should be chosen. One is how bad things are going to be initially, and one is how bad or good things are going to be eventually. And the question marks mean this is not optimistic interpretation. So just going through them, ECN traversal, as Stuart has just said, is pretty good. We don't need to traverse layer 4 middle boxes because you end the congestion control at that point. So you have two segments of congestion control if you have a layer 4 middle box or higher. For tunnels, the RFCs on ECN are all pretty complete, but there's likely to be a lot of non-compliant tunnels actually implemented that don't propagate ECN. So if you stick your AQM in the middle of it, you'll probably find drop comes out the other end, not ECN. Where an operator is going to deploy an AQM, they are likely to fix their own tunnels. They probably wouldn't put it in and not fix their own tunnels, but you can get end user tunnels, IPsec or whatever, that could cause problems in your host. If you put your AQM at a lower layer, you're probably only going to do that if you're able to do it. One example is in a radio network, in the radio access network for cellular, where they actually define it should be done where there's the PDCP layer, the packet data convergence protocol, and they have to dip into the IP header if they're going to change it, even though it's a bit of a violation. But you can do it. Code points is the only item where it's red, because obviously we've just used the last code point in the ECN field, and there aren't many other places in the IP header. It goes green eventually on the basis that if the experiment is totally successful, you might free up the ECT naught field.
Where you're optimistic.
Yeah. That's eventually, so after the heat death of the universe. Right? Then there's reordering issues. A corner case is that this is a corner case. You can get a reordering situation if you've got a classic ECN AQM on the same path as one of these new ones, and so if that classic one has marked some CE, what we're proposing is that CE would be classified into one of these new queues, and so then the CE from an ECT naught path will go into an ECT1 queue. However, pretty much a corner case, given there's no classic ECN implemented in routers or in the network at the moment, and multi-bottleneck congestion is pretty unusual anyway. So you've got sort of two unusuals multiplied together.
We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. Yeah. And also, if that does happen, what will happen is the reordering will mean that your certain packets in your classic flow, we'll call it, those that were marked CE arrive early. So it's not late reordering, it's early reordering, if you like. You could say that all the other packets arrive late, but it's yep. And then finally, TCP control packets, unless ECT is allowed because of the new generalized ECN draft, you will get, if you attempt to set ECT1, but you can't set it on control packets, they will go into the wrong queue. And so your control packets will be delayed and more likely to be lost, which is why you don't want to do that. Okay? The meaning of this new identifier. And I want to pick up with maybe Christian and some other people and point out the history of this, that when RFC 3168 was originally defined, the reason ECN was made the same as drop was not through ignorance, it was because there were too many proposals for anything else, and it was like the lowest common denominator. It was a bit like a 53 byte ATM cell. And
So we're going to have a clear definition of what the meaning of this, of a CE mark on ECT1 packets means. Otherwise, we'll just end up arguing forever. Now, the definition we've currently put in the draft includes a square, and this square is not arbitrary. It's because the current internet has a square root in it. That's the only reason there's a square there. And the current internet exists. I know you say it doesn't exist for all the slow starts, but that's not relevant to this particular thing. We think, or certainly from measurement experience so far. If you're going to have a relationship as well as a square or whatever, you would need a constant of proportionality, but we don't think that needs to be standardized. That we think that can be operator dependent.
Is it your last slide, Bob?
I believe so. Oh yeah, process, which is
we'll just skip that.
Michael's just done all that.
Yeah. Okay.
Matt Mathis, I have a published paper, a little paper, an editorial on the square root of P formula, in which I point out that this is a bug in the internet. We don't need to preserve it. Please, we don't need to preserve it. We don't want to be backwards compatible with that feature of TCP. That the 1/square root of P model accurately represents what the internet does, but it doesn't do what we wanted the internet to do. And we're out of scale because of it at higher data rates. Don't be backwards compatible with that. That's not.
Oh, whoa. What I'm saying is that this ECT1 queue is just a FIFO queue. But when it's marking, the definition of its mark is its own mark. If you don't have any of that other traffic, it doesn't have to be backward compatible with it. But if you have the other traffic, you need something to say how the two relate.
The problem is that there's some sort of transition that's needed. It's not clear how to do it, where we recognize that TCP is not friendly with itself, and we need to forget the idea of TCP friendly and move to a different model for congestion control, for which trying to be backwards compatible with TCP is doomed to cause other problems.
I thought you were agreeing with me, but you seem to be saying we don't need to even try. But what I'm trying to do is do no harm, which I think
we're going into the people's slots. Can we? I'm sorry.
Can I just finish the sentence?
Yeah, sure.
What we're trying to do is do no harm to the existing internet, and we've achieved that, and so I believe that's your company motto as well.
Christian Wittmer. Yeah, I mean, there are two comments. There's one about the L4S packet classifier, and I do believe that your reliance there on the square root formula is a bug, and you should find another way to balance the marking on the two queues. So that's one, but that's not what is discussed here. Okay. The other point, the reason it's a bug, to complete what Matt was saying, is that first, there are a number of currently deployed congestion schemes that do not obey the square root formula.
Yeah.
I mean, an example is Cubic.
No.
Cubic at high rate.
All the experiments we did were with Cubic.
No.
All the ones you saw were with Cubic.
It depends at which rate. Cubic at higher rates follows the log formula
until
the square root formula.
It only started going away from with a 10 millisecond round trip time. It only started going away from fairness at 500 megabits per second. Cubic.
Yes.
Yeah.
But 500 megabits per second is not that a big a rate nowadays.
No, but if we're trying to get off it, we don't need to worry too much about high rate classic traffic, because we're going to get all that high rate traffic into the new class.
And that's not the only one. CTCP does not follow strictly the square root formula.
We know, but it does. It does at low rates.
No, it does under strict constraint. Otherwise, when you are not constrained, it goes much higher. And that's.
But the point is, we have to choose something.
Yeah.
This sounds like it's moved into an L4S discussion, whereas the topic here was just why is ECT1 a useful code point, not what is L4S going to do it. Let's see if we can squeeze in this quick heads up on FEC v2 before, because I think we're basically at time at this point. Miriam, did you have something to add?
Yeah, so Mia Kulevin, given that there was a lot of positive feedback on the L4S BOF, and this is urgently needed, and this document is around for a while, and it's a good shape, when are you planning to ask for adoption of this document?
We need to do the process one first. So we need to figure out what we're going to do with the whole discussion thing first.
Mm-hmm.
So because the other discussion was long, there's no discussion on that at this meeting. But that one comes up on Friday.
Okay.
And now for something completely different.
Yeah, completely different. So I will try to be as short as possible, going to the main points if possible. Okay, so next. Yes, so this talk is about, sorry, I am Vincent, and this is joint work with Ali Begen, the second author. And what we are trying to do is to update this RFC that was published in 2011 by the FEC Frame Working Group, same name. And since the FEC Frame Working Group has been closed a few years ago, this is the reason why I'm here today. So the goal is to add FEC protection to real-time flows, either for unicast or multicast transmissions. Next. And this standard FEC frame, the one that was published in 2011, is already included in 3GPP MBMS services. So this is the kind of services that will be used whenever you have a lot of people interested by the same content at the same time in the same place. So it makes sense to use multicast, broadcast transmission in that case. So if it is a file, then you will use a specific protocol through TLC, standardized at IETF. If it is a real-time streaming session with strict end-to-end delay latency constraints, then you will use FEC frame. Next. So this is an overview of the architecture. So it is not really a protocol, it's more a shim layer that will fit between applications that generate one or several RTP flows and UDP. And you see on the right this FEC scheme part, which is where the FCN coding is taking place. So from time to time, the sender generates some repair packets and sends them on the network. So currently in RFC 63, we are limited to block codes. I will explain what it is. And what we are proposing is to add convolutional codes as well. Next. So this is the very simple view of what block code, how it operates. So you accumulate a certain number of source packets, and when you have enough to fill in a block, then you do efficient coding and you transmit repair packets. And of course, if, for instance, the second packet is erased during transmission, which may happen, then you will have to wait until receiving the first repair packets to be able to recover this erasure. So that's the point. With convolutional codes, that's totally different. We are using an encoding window that will slide progressively over the set of source symbols. And of course, you will be able to produce more the same number of repair packets, but more regularly, on a regular basis, more frequently. And so if this packet is erased, then it will be quickly recovered because there is a repair packet that will arrive very soon after. Next. So just to summarize, I'm not going into the details, but to summarize, with block code, you add the same latency to anybody, no matter whether this receiver has good reception conditions or not. Everybody will experience the same latency, and in fact, there is an incentive to use a big block in order to be more robust in front of long erasure bursts. And of course, you have to find a balance. So with convolutional code, this is totally solved because good receivers will experience almost zero latency, and bad receivers will still experience latency that is an order of magnitude lower than those of block, than in case you are using block codes. I don't have time to go to the details, so I will skip it, but you can believe me and we can discuss this offline. It's really efficient. So the RFC is a little bit changed, but we are doing that in an incremental way, which means that we are adding a new capability to FEC frame. We are not removing nor compromising any of the previous capabilities of FEC frame, which means that legacy receiver will still be working they will discover by looking at the SDP description that, okay, this session does not, is not for them because they involve an FXC scheme that they don't support, that they don't know about, so they will avoid joining this session. But if the sender has 2 sessions in parallel for old receivers and new receivers, then we can satisfy, say, thousands or millions of receivers at the same time with only 2 flows, so it's quite cheap. Next. There is running code for FakeFrame version 1, the old one. I did it, and currently I'm working on updating this implementation for FakeFrame version 2, and hopefully I hope to have something for next IETF, some working code time. So there is an additional internet draft that was presented 1 year ago at the Network Coding Research Group. You can have a look. And of course, all of this makes no sense if you don't have any fake scheme for convolutional code. So of course, we will also propose at least this simple one, this random linear code fake scheme. That's it.
Do we have any questions? This is one of these topics which occasionally comes to TSVWG because other groups in the IETF have stopped working on it, and therefore the transport area as a whole needs expertise. So I'd just like to, could you indicate with a show of hands if you've read this, or you would be willing to read this, or you're interested in working on FakeFrame type proposals? Could you raise your hand if there's any interest in this subject? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yeah.
5. Yeah, okay. There seems to be some people interested. Carry on working on it and carry on using this group to discuss it, please.
Oh, great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Are we going to take the other draft we didn't do today on Friday?
We will try on Friday.
Okay.
As time permits.
Okay.
Blue sheets. Who's got the blue sheets?
Please tell us who got the blue sheets.
We sent them 2 out. Okay, there's one.
And please come along on Friday for a continuation of this, and also to discuss the drafts that we haven't had time to discuss today. Right. Yeah, sorry.